How did Jewish monotheists come to worship a man? Our first step for trying to understand this is to consider whether any of their existing beliefs in Scripture could somehow accommodate that, or at least give us hints of how it suddenly happened in the first century. And in order to understand that, we must try to look past the paradigms that Christianity has wrought on the world and try not to anachronistically apply our ways of thinking. In other words, we must try to think like a Jew before Jesus came along, which is admittedly not easy. Our first step will be to search the Scriptures to try to see what we can learn about their earliest beliefs, which often colored later beliefs. Then we'll come forward to the Roman era, to a culture for which we have more historical evidence apart from, and sometimes different from, their most sacred scriptures. The first hurdle to remove from our understanding in this investigation is to dispense with a relatively modern notion of gods that, ironically, was brought about on the world by later Christian views. But it did not occur until well after the first century. In the time that the New Testament was being written, it was widely accepted that there was a continuum between mere men on earth and the gods in the heavens. Gods could assume the form of men, and men could be divinized. And in between, there were all sorts of at least partly divine beings, and sometimes a man could become one of them. The idea that gods could appear as men is easy for moderns to understand, but the idea that men could somehow become more divine? Not so much. How could the Egyptians, for instance, think their king was an actual god? Didn't those kings continue to die like mere mortals? The reason moderns have difficulty understanding this is because they think of divinity as something utterly fundamentally different from humanity. And this is actually largely a product of later Christian thought. Before Christianity altered the world's view on the matter, virtually everyone in the ancient world believed that men could be at least partially divinized, whether before they died or after. What is hardest for modern believers to grasp is how some such beliefs could be held by the Jews and even were reflected in the Hebrew Bible itself. I alluded to this in a previous lesson on the uses of the term Elohim, but it bears further examination here. So I'll cite a few examples of the biblical author's views on there being a divine continuum. Then we'll return to modern scholarship's view of how first century Jews understood Jesus to be divine. Then we'll try to see how such views stack up against what the New Testament authors actually said about it. It may seem silly to moderns to read Greek tales, for instance, where the gods have to physically travel on earth to get to where they're going, as if they were like men in physical bodies. They would even appear to men as men. But we should note that this is exactly the way the Hebrew Bible occasionally depicts God and angels, which are, of course, other types of divine beings, and of a lower divine status. How did Adam know when God was nearby and so tried to hide from him? Because he heard God walking through the garden. 3 men appeared to Abraham in Genesis 18. At least 2 were angels. The third spoke to Abraham with the message of God, whether it was Yahweh himself or merely an angel who delivered Yahweh's words. They took and ate the food Abraham prepared for them as men who have physical bodies. When they left Abraham, they walked to Sodom. In the next chapter, the 2 angels eat again, this time with Lot. When an angel comes to Daniel in Daniel 10, he tells Daniel that he was delayed. Not only that, but he had to wait on the quote-unquote prince, Michael, another angel, to come and aid him, possibly so he could go to Daniel. So not only are these angels traveling like men, at least sometimes, but they're warring. Of course, God and his angels can appear as men, and maybe at least sometimes angels are bound by space-time. These are not insurmountable concepts of modern logic, if we take as given the hypothetical existence of divine being. But how can a man be somehow more divine, or even partly divine? It may surprise you to notice that the Hebrew Bible actually has a lot of interesting comments on this as well. But before we look at what the authors of the Bible thought, it will help us to see common beliefs in the ancient world regarding divineness. Before Christianity gained massive influence over the world, it was commonly assumed that men who did extremely great things not only had the assistance of the gods, but were thus often proved to be at least partially divine. Romulus, the man in the myth of the founding of Rome, was said to be, quote, God born of a god, end quote. Alexander the Great, Julius, and Augustus Caesar, and many other men of antiquity were said to have divine heritage, and were therefore in some sense also divine. But having a god impregnate an ancestor was not the only way for men to somehow become divine in some sense. Some were believed to have obtained it by their own valor. Older scholarship often discounted such rhetoric as mere political propaganda, concluding that people did not really believe that men could become closer to the gods somehow. But scholars have begun to shift towards trying to understand what the common people actually believe, which is admittedly more difficult since writings that have come down to us are almost completely from the less so-called superstitious elite. One of the ways that we can see what all strata of people believed in the ancient world is by looking at their actions, which of course can speak louder than the written explanations of belief that have come down to us. And the evidence is clear that people did indeed treat certain men like the gods, especially in the emperor cults. One of the most interesting inscriptions, especially in the context of our present study of Christ devotion, was found in Asia Minor, one of the key hubs from which Christianity spread, in which Augustus is described as being the benefactor of all people and a savior who put an end to war and established all things, having surpassed the benefactors born before him. Thus, the birthday of the God marked for the world the beginning of good tidings through his coming. For more examples of the evidence we have from men actually being considered divine, even non-rulers, see Ehrman's How Jesus Became God, Chapter 1. I believe one of the main concepts that must be grasped in order for us moderns to at least partially understand how the ancients could consider some men divine is the viewpoint that divinity is a continuum. Beings with the attribute of quote-unquote divineness fall on a spectrum of very divine, such as the supreme God, in which, as we've seen, the pagans also believed. And then there were other powerful gods, but not as powerful. Then there were local gods that might be the god of towns or cities. And there were even lower divine beings, such as daimons, which should not be confused with our concept of demon. They could be either good or evil, or somewhere in the middle, but they were more powerful than humans. Because they were lower on the divine scale, they interacted more with humans, and humans themselves could move on the scale of divinity, at least the lower end. By now, mental bells should be ringing. Of course, the Bible has its counterparts to at least some of these levels of divinity. There are certain angels through the entire Bible who report up to God, and these angels are often depicted with superhuman powers. By the time of the apocalyptic prophets, we even read of archangels, presumably because they are higher in rank than other angels. They are greater divine beings. Along with the Hebrew Bible's multiple names for divine beings, which we'll see in a moment, Ephesians 6 and Colossians 1 curiously employ multiple terms: rulers, authorities, cosmic powers, and spiritual forces. By the time we get to the New Testament, we even read of demons who have supernatural powers on earth, such as the ability to break chains or even divination. The references to stories of angels being cast out of heaven is further evidence for views of hierarchy among divine beings. But how can humans be anywhere on this divine scale, at least according to the Bible? Well, didn't God at the very beginning put his own spirit and image into man? In the life of Adam and Eve, written around the time of Jesus' birth, we see the angels being forced to reverence that image in Adam himself. In chapter 4 of my book, I cover the use of Elohim, the plural of God, used for God himself, the angels, and man. And Jesus does not fail to notice this use either in John 10. When they picked up stones to kill him because he was making himself equal to God, he curiously does not defend the uniqueness of himself, as Christian apologists might do, but quotes Psalm 82 in order to show the divinity in humans. And that divinity, as we've seen in other pagan beliefs, is due to divine sonship. It should be obvious by now that moderns, including Bible believers, are curiously disconnected from the beliefs of even biblical authors regarding the nature of divinity being on a continuum between man and God, not separated via an empty chasm between the earthly and God. Applying this modern view onto the ancients is a gross anachronism and did not reach full development until centuries after Christ. In a moment, we're going to consider the strongest language in the Hebrew Bible that suggests that some of God's sons among men might have been elevated higher in the divine continuum. But before we do, we should briefly consider again the ways that the Hebrew Bible presents God among the gods, so that we are not anachronistically projecting monotheism onto the ancients. Scholars have long noted that the strongest monotheistic language does not appear until Isaiah. You might think that the 10 Commandments of Exodus 20 was monotheistic, but notice the command is to have no other gods before God. It does not explicitly deny the existence of the other gods. The actual term for this is monolatry, the worship of one God, not the belief in one God. Monolatry was actually the radical idea that the Torah brought to the world. How ironic is it that we moderns struggle so much with the second most radical idea that the Bible brought to the world, the worship of Jesus? As we've seen with other examples, the strongest monotheistic language of Isaiah does not preclude even his belief in other divine beings, such as angels, cherubim, and seraphim. We moderns should pause to ask ourselves how such a view of the divine realm and the beings that inhabit it differ from that of the pagans. The first objection that comes to your mind is probably that the ancient gods could act in very human ways, which even we mere mortals would consider disgraceful. Firstly, though, we should recall that the Platonists were already rejecting such ideas of the gods around the time that the bulk of the Hebrew Bible was being penned. Secondly, what do some biblical authors believe about what some angels did to get cast out of heaven? Were they not engaging in the same activity that Zeus did when he saw a pretty girl he wanted? If you'd like to see a lesson on that, I'll put a link to the article and the video in the description. And as I've noted before, the Hebrew Bible's laws were more concerned with what you did, not as much as what one believed, a shift that we primarily only see in the writings of Paul and John, who focused quite a bit on doctrines that are to be believed as obligatory for the faithful follower of God. But in the Torah especially, you simply followed the law and you were good with God. There were virtually no creeds or statements of faith that one had to hold in order to be right with God. There was certainly an emphasis on the heart and such important things as loving God and your fellow, but not on doctrines that one had to believe. Applying this principle to the topic at hand, it's entirely conceivable that ancient Hebrews could have worshipped God alone, per the instruction of the Torah, and believed anything they liked about the existence of other divine beings. And even Christians today still believe in angels, archangels, demons, cherubim, and seraphim. Not to mention a man who was exalted to the divine. This is a great place for another one of my philosophical asides. From the viewpoint of a fundamentalist, it is even theoretically plausible that God has always met people where they are at, without trying to explain all the eternal truths at once, or ever for that matter. How could flesh and blood, clay vessels, understand all the divine anyway? Why would Abraham and the rest of his idolatrous family, or Jacob and Rachel, who stole her father's idols, need to understand some doctrine about the unique nature of God if all God needed them to do was to obey His command to worship only Him? In fact, as I cover in other lessons, God's messages are often sparse with detail about why He commands something, so long as it is obeyed. And indeed, what was there to explain? The idea that there is only one supreme God at the hierarchy of divine beings was at least as ancient as the 6th century BC among even the pagans. So now that we've seen that divinity is in both the pagan and biblical realms of thought was not a binary trait, one which a being either had in full or not at all, let's consider the evidence from the Hebrew Bible of whether men could in fact somehow become more divine. I've heard some conservative Christians lament the common idea that people become angels when they die, since the Bible never says this explicitly. However, the idea is actually very ancient. In the Apocalypse of 2nd Baruch, from about the 1st century AD, we see the belief that those who have obeyed God's law will not only cease to age, but, quote, will be made as the angels and be made equal to the stars, end quote. Indeed, their quote-unquote excellence will even surpass that of the angels. Probably written a little before 2nd Baruch, 2nd Enoch 22 says that Enoch became indistinguishable from the glorious ones, and his face bright, and he no longer needed to eat or sleep. The parallels to the stories of Moses should be obvious, whose face became so bright after talking with God on the mountain that he had to put a veil over his face, and who was on the mountain for 40 days without sustenance or water. Although Moses later died like other men, and even though his death was not as special perhaps as God whisking away of Elijah or Enoch into the heavens, he was special in the sense that it was God who buried him in a secret place that no one knew. It should not surprise us that, by the 2nd century BC, Sirach 45 concludes that God made Moses, quote, equal in glory to the holy ones, end quote. In the very Bible itself, in Ezekiel 28, the king of Tyre is actually called a cherub, placed by God on the holy mountain of God. This is most likely figurative language representing just how exalted God had made him, but it is still a powerful, possible parallel to Moses, and I believe a likely reflection of the concept of, quote, as above, so below, end quote, which I cover in my video on the rise of apocalypticism, which I'll link below. There are biblical passages that show that Moses was clearly closer to God, which included his ability to speak to God face to face, despite seeing God's face being lethal to mortals. Of course, Exodus 33 seems to temper the view of Moses as slightly more divine by showing that he too will die if he sees God's actual face. But unlike other men, Moses gets to see the backside of God, for what that's worth. Psalm 8 says that man was made a little lower than the Elohim, which is typically translated angels. But the word is also the same one used for God, even in the plural. But what evidence is there that man could be made higher in the Hebrew Bible, apart from what we've already noticed about Moses? Jesus in Matthew 22 does make one curious comment regarding man becoming like the angels after death, even if it is only in regard to one trait, the lack of gender or the practice of marriage. Luke 20 adds that they are like the angels and that they can never more die. But Hebrews 1 makes another curious comment about men and angels. Though its main point is to show that Jesus is superior to angels, the final verse actually also adds the detail that the angels even serve those who are to inherit salvation, human beings. And I should not skip over Acts 12 either, where Rhoda claims to have seen Peter, who everyone thinks is still in prison. Their response? It is his angel. What? Did they equate a human spirit with an angel? And let's not fail to notice that one of the reasons the book of Enoch chose its name was because the individual named Enoch in the Hebrew Bible was somehow close to God, for he walked with him. Compare this to Adam, who walked with God initially, yet lost that privilege. Moses' departure from earth was similar to Enoch's in the sense that God was directly involved. Yet Enoch arguably received greater divine glory, for he was taken and, quote, was not, end quote. He did not die like Moses. Interestingly, when the author of the succession of Elisha mirrored the succession details of Joshua and Moses, he selected an Enoch-like detail for Elijah's departure as well. Except Elijah did one better with his fiery horses and a fiery chariot. But the detail most pertinent for our progression towards the New Testament treatment of Jesus as someone who ascended to heaven is that Jesus was not the first to be exalted to the divine realm, but the third. Some religious folks I know would argue that Jesus went to a different place, but I'll leave that discussion to the theologians. So we've seen hints in the Hebrew Bible of men appearing or being treated more divine than other men, and later works fleshing out the angelology that incorporates at least Moses and Enoch. And the Hebrew Bible managed to maintain that monolatry was the only legitimate form of worship in light of these beliefs. And certainly, by the post-exilic period, monotheism was at least a developing view of biblical orthodoxy, which became the view of the vast majority of Jews in the Roman era. I'll come back to angelology when we consider New Testament passages about Jesus, which should prove quite interesting. For now, we have a few more examples to consider from the Hebrew Bible regarding how a human could possibly become somehow more divine. The use of the expression Son of Man in Daniel 7 is certainly a passage we'll come back to when we consider how the New Testament uses it for Jesus. But for now, I'd like to look at it in its original context by itself and see evidence for how it was understood before the Christian era. Based on the details given, it seems obvious that this is a messianic figure who receives dominion from the Ancient of Days, which is quite obviously a reference to God. After Daniel's succession of empires, at least through the Greeks, this figure would finally bring God's rule over all the earth. As we've noted, the Hebrew Bible almost always presents the Davidic Messiah as simply a descendant of him. In other words, a man. A son of man in the sense of being human. However, Daniel 7 intentionally chooses the term son of man that the other prophets use to speak of mere humans, and yet applies it to one who comes with the clouds. Who does God let ride on the clouds with him? Daniel leaves us with a lot of questions, but first Enoch was quite willing to provide, well before the New Testament writers did so. In fact, first Enoch was so prolific on the topic of the Son of Man that I will only provide a sampling here. Enoch's portrayal of the Son of Man has very clear parallels to Daniel 7, such as one who is accompanied by and chosen by the Ancient of Days, and who is involved in judgment of sinners and kings. But first Enoch provides a great deal more details. His countenance is full of grace, like one of the holy angels. His name was named or invoked before creation, leaving us to wonder if this is suggesting that he's so divine that he was pre-existent. Regardless of what the author intended, by the time we get to the Gospel of John, this is clearly believed of Jesus. Enoch, Son of Man, is a light to the Gentiles, a concept clearly used in the writings of Luke. Enoch goes on to say that all who dwell on the earth will fall and worship before him, and will praise and bless and celebrate with song the Lord of Spirit. Wait, what? Larry Hurtado has argued extensively in his books that this is a kind of obeisance the Jews could give to people in authority, especially kings, without it being considered the kind of worship rightfully reserved for Yahweh. I would be interested in hearing from any expert in Ge'ez, the language of the text, as to what precisely is said here. Some translations render it worship, while others say bend the knee. Regardless, as we've been seeing, there is much else to present some level of divinity in this Son of Man figure in 1st Enoch. But there are other passages in the Hebrew Bible itself that might have helped first century Jews somehow accept that a man could have become God in some sense. We've been considering examples of how men seem to be more like the angels in some way, but now we turn to perhaps the most overlooked suggestions that man could become more divine. Overlooked not because they suggest that a few men somehow became more like angels, but that they could somehow become more like Yahweh himself. Let's return to Moses. One of the most jarring statements in the Hebrew Bible for a monotheist would have been in Exodus 4:16 and 7:1. At least if you don't have an interpretation of it that makes it consistent with monotheism. It literally says that Moses would be as God. Of course, the immediate context is in fact that Moses is speaking for God, but to grasp the full weight of what the author is trying to say, we should also consider the full account. Aaron will be like a prophet as he will deliver the message to the people, but Moses will be like God because he will provide the message. If the meaning here were simply that Aaron would be talking because he was a better speaker, then surely the wording of the explanation need not have raised so many questions. Surely something else is going on here. At a minimum, Moses is being given a very special authority, unlike any other man or even prophet. As I've already noted in another lesson, which I'll link below, Moses' revelation is different than most other prophets just in the sense that he gives laws, when most other prophets exhort the people to follow the law, not some new revelation. His enduring, elevated authority is seen when New Testament writers speak not just of the prophets, but of Moses and the prophets. And in order to make the case for Jesus' special elevation, Hebrews does not say that he was superior to all the prophets before, but singles out Moses especially in chapter 3. How did later writers understand language regarding Moses as in Exodus 4:16 and 7:1? Before Christianity's debates about the nature of Christ in relation to God were widespread. Philo gives us some of the strongest remarks regarding Moses' being made more divine, even more like God himself, not just the angels. Though Philo is still a monotheist and makes it clear that Moses is not the same as God, he explicitly states that he became more divine. How does Philo explain this? He sounds peculiarly like a 2nd or 3rd century Christian explaining the nature of Jesus in relation to God. Yet Philo is writing between 40 to 49 AD about Moses. When explaining how God advanced Moses to higher degrees of improvement by his word, the same word with which he created the cosmos, Moses is advanced all the way up to God himself. Yet he says that God is not susceptible of any subtraction or addition. And if you're thinking you might have heard a hint of the beginning of John, we will come back to this, as John does indeed sound remarkably like Philo. For now, just note that Philo even seems to be conceiving of Moses as pre-existent, which would certainly be something John echoes regarding Jesus. So we've seen some pretty incredible elaborations of biblical passages which suggest that Moses was closer to God than other mere mortals. But there's one more person in the Hebrew Bible who gets special elevation from Yahweh, and that is the son of David. Similar to the way Moses is portrayed as predicting a prophet to come after him, to whom the people must listen, David is promised that a future son of his will establish God's kingdom on earth. But there's one comment that most moderns probably miss. God significantly says that I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son to me. This is precisely the concept of how other kings of the ancient world were considered divine, even gods. This is not merely the sonship of God that all mankind is said to possess, or even Israel herself, but an even more special sonship. I believe that the Psalms are an often overlooked portal into the earliest understandings of Torah and the prophets. These 5 collections of books of ancient hymns developed many interpretations and prophetic statements which had a great influence over what Judaism would become, and even Christianity. And this is especially true regarding one of their most important understandings of Scripture, the hope in the future king who would finally establish God's kingdom on earth. So we should not be surprised to find that the promises of a son of David who was still to come was elaborated on in the Psalms. Psalm 89 is a great example of portraying God as among the gods, or Elohim. as we examined in a previous section. And it also portrays God as crushing a mythical sea creature named Rahab, a common pagan understanding of how the world came to be, and how good and evil both exist. The difference is that in the pagan myths, it was a cosmic struggle, while in the Hebrew understanding of God, there was probably no contest. God conquered chaos, whether it was the void of the earth during creation, when it only took his word to bring order, or whether it was his control of all kings of the earth, even when he was using them to punish his own chosen Israel. I plan to expound on the Hebrew Bible's use of ancient myth to portray its God as far superior in later lessons. But for now, I just want to establish the connection of the message of Psalm 89 as it is important for understanding its message regarding the Son of David. God is the greatest in heaven and earth among the Elohim, and on earth he will eventually establish what? A rule that will have no end, whose king will be the Son of David. How will this man be different from other men? He will not just be made from the Son of God, as in 2 Samuel 7, but Yahweh promises to make him the firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth. The end of the hymn gives us even more context. The author is living in a time when the dynasty of David has ended, and they are pleading with God to answer, "How long, O Lord, will you forsake the Davidic covenant?" In other words, the author is still holding out hope for this future Son of God to come and establish God's rule. Let's pause for a moment and consider this in light of the question of how Jesus could come to be considered God. Of course, the New Testament references this psalm, or at least alludes to its ideas. Secular scholars often try to make out as if the Davidic Messiah they were waiting for were merely a man and not divine. It is, of course, entirely plausible that many Jews believed that the Messiah would merely be a man. But to conclude that everyone did would be to ignore these incredible passages. This is an anachronistic view that projects even modern Christian views of the stark separation of man and the divine onto the ancient text. Yet it is often secular scholars that do it. God could indeed elevate men in divine status in the eyes of some authors of the Hebrew Bible, and these passages are highly suggestive. In other words, the prophetic seed for Christ worship was already there, even if there were other additional causes of its development. Later we'll see how many modern scholars largely ignore this, but for now, let's see some more prophecy about the anticipated Son of David. Psalm 2 is especially significant. Not only was David declared to be God's firstborn, the highest of all kings of the earth, but he was also begotten of God. What does it mean to be born of God? I don't know, but it seems perfectly plausible that some would interpret it as the Son of David becoming more divine. We know for a fact, actually, that this is exactly what happened with Jesus. This passage is cited in Acts 13:33, and Hebrews 1:5 and 5:5. There are, of course, debates about how divine authors of the New Testament thought Jesus, as we'll explore, but no debate about whether he was at least exalted to some extent, whether based on a high or a low Christology. I've been mentioning New Testament interpretation, but would also like to pause and view things from a more ancient perspective. How would a post-exilic Jew before Jesus interpret past events in light of such passages? That they were waiting on something pretty special as events quite incredibly in both the Hebrew Bible and in other sacred texts before Christ, as we've been citing. But we should also not forget how Hebrew prophecy worked, as it was not just concerned with future fulfillments. The special typological prophetic fulfillments before the future one for the Davidic Messiah are plainly seen in the narratives surrounding key sons of David, especially Josiah and Solomon. Before Matthew 17 gave us the transfiguration, where Jesus went up a mountain and his face shone like Moses, and God's voice declared his sonship and authority, we have the story of Solomon dedicating the temple on Mount Moriah, the new dwelling place of God instead of the tabernacle that Moses built. When a cloud descended, ostensibly to indicate the presence of God, and fire from heaven consumed the sacrifices. And these compilations containing the accounts from 1 Kings 9 and 2 Chronicles 7 were completed after the exile. Once again, how are the ancients to understand such stories in light of the entire world's view of how God's made kings their sons, and thus more divine? Such a view did not apparently at all conflict with the strict monolatry as commanded by the Torah. And, as I'm trying to argue, it also did not conflict with even the monotheism in Isaiah, a view that included a continuum of divinity populated by God at the top, but also lesser divine beings towards the middle, and even with the idea that man could somehow get up into that continuum. Let's consider a few more passages regarding just how elevated the Son of David could be, even before Jesus. because I believe the level of exaltation of these is often overlooked today, even by believing lovers of Scripture, because of our modern views of the separation between the divine and man. Zechariah 12 says something similar to the passage that Moses will be like God. It says that on the day when God begins to bring salvation, the house of David would be like God, like the angel of Yahweh. In fact, this section of Zechariah says some pretty incredible things, though often cryptic, which Christians have often used to defend their case for Jesus as Christ. I would not include the sampling of them in this section here, except they actually seem to relate to Zechariah's view of the coming Davidic Messiah being like God. But make of them what you will. Again, this is not an apology for Christianity, but only an attempt to understand the author. I would also like to point out before enumerating these details that the context is prediction both of Jerusalem's destruction and salvation, of the judgment of her rulers, and the final establishment of Yahweh's rule. It sounds like the author is vacillating, but I would argue that he is intentionally creating this seeming dichotomy for a purpose. In Zechariah 11, in the midst of God's pronouncement of judgment of the evil shepherds who consume the flock, it seems that the prophet is made shepherd, doomed to be slaughtered by the sheep traders. Is this a riff off of the Joseph story? More on how the Hebrew authors riffed in later lessons. But the prophet not only brings judgment on those evil shepherds, but annuls the covenant. Then the prophet says to the bad shepherds, "If it seems good to you, give me my wages," which I would argue is a reference to the Jacob story, where he requests wages from Laban as shepherd. This passage is quite cryptic and gets even more so, leaving the New Testament writers several details to apply to Jesus, whether they invented them or not. "And they weighed out as my wages 30 pieces of silver. Then Yahweh said to me, throw it to the potter, the lordly price at which I was priced by them. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of Yahweh to the potter." Fast forward back into chapter 12, where we have the statement that David will be like God and the angel of Yahweh. We have not only a cryptic statement, but one which actually begs the question, how can Yahweh be pierced? And why does Zechariah repeat the motif found in Scripture of the mourning for the only child or firstborn? It was on this day of mourning that, moving into chapter 13, a fountain would be opened for the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to cleanse them from sin, when the idols would finally be cut off from the land, and prophets too. More cryptic statements follow regarding wounds from friends, striking of the shepherd, and the sheep scattering, etc. But these will do for now. I just want to emphasize that Zechariah's comment that the house of David becoming like God is couched in a prophecy about a special coming great day of the Lord, when the unrighteous shepherds will be severely punished, and God's king will finally rule with power and do something about God's broken covenant and the sins of Israel, specifically in Jerusalem. What about other passages that seem to exalt the Son of David, even up to the right hand of God? Some have argued that Psalm 45, 6-8 may be addressing the king as God, and there is no doubt here that the king has been anointed beyond his companions. However, Isaiah 9, 6-7 does in fact do this explicitly, saying that the child born to us, upon whose shoulders authority rests, is named Mighty God, and even Everlasting Father. It is easy enough to see how Christians would have applied this to Jesus, even more so considering the context that Isaiah is speaking of Galilee of the Gentiles, where the peoples walking in darkness see a great light. Many scholars see this as probably believed to refer to Hezekiah before Jesus was born. Regardless, it is a definite reference to a man becoming more divine in some sense. And finally, we have Psalm 110, attributed to David, which plainly says that Yahweh says to my Lord, "Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool." This is clearly a throne beside God's throne, sharing the glory of God, though the anointed one sitting in it is clearly a different individual from God. Psalm 110 is quoted quite a bit in the New Testament to help people understand that a man, Jesus, could somehow become divine. And the logical question is there raised, who is David speaking of when he mentions this other Lord? How can his own descendant be his Lord? We're going to further investigate the oldest evidence we have for how Christ worship developed, but first, in order to understand, for example, the Gospel of John's take on who Jesus was, we must first understand how something could be spoken of as God in the next lesson.